The orders came in the last days of February 2002, delivered in windowless rooms where fluorescent light flattened every face. Soldiers crowded onto metal chairs, steaming coffee cups balanced on their knees, rifles propped against the walls. The maps looked simple: a valley in eastern Afghanistan, rimmed by mountains like the walls of a cracked bowl. The Shah-i-Kot. Intelligence estimated a few hundred enemy fighters hiding in caves and trenches, maybe less. A sweep, the officers called it. A quick strike. One major tapped the map with a pointer. "We move in, secure the valley floor, press them into the high ground. Then the air takes care of the rest." Some men leaned forward eagerly, as though already breathing victory. Others sat rigid, glancing at each other in silence. They had heard promises before. Promises of short battles, easy wins, promises that never accounted for what waited in the dirt. The valley was given a name before it was ever entered: Operation Anaconda, a name meant to strangle, a name that carried the certainty of victory. If you want more untold stories from the War on Terror, accounts where the official briefing never matched the brutal reality, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories can travel beyond the wire. Outside the briefing room, the Afghan wind howled across mountains that had swallowed armies for centuries. Inside, it was all confidence and slides: aircraft numbers, ammunition counts, timetables sketched in neat boxes. But beneath the statistics, a different rhythm beat in the chest of every man. They had felt the weight of silence in valleys that looked empty until they erupted in fire. One soldier shifted in his chair and whispered to the man beside him, "They say this one's easy." The orders came in the last days of February 2002, delivered in windowless rooms where fluorescent light flattened every face. Soldiers crowded onto metal chairs, steaming coffee cups balanced on their knees, rifles propped against the walls. The maps looked simple: a valley in eastern Afghanistan, rimmed by mountains like the walls of a cracked bowl. The Shah-i-Kot. Intelligence estimated a few hundred enemy fighters hiding in caves and trenches, maybe less. A sweep, the officers called it. A quick strike. One major tapped the map with a pointer. "We move in, secure the valley floor, press them into the high ground. Then the air takes care of the rest." Some men leaned forward eagerly, as though already breathing victory. Others sat rigid, glancing at each other in silence. They had heard promises before. Promises of short battles, easy wins, promises that never accounted for what waited in the dirt. The valley was given a name before it was ever entered: Operation Anaconda, a name meant to strangle, a name that carried the certainty of victory. If you want more untold stories from the War on Terror, accounts where the official briefing never matched the brutal reality, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories can travel beyond the wire. Outside the briefing room, the Afghan wind howled across mountains that had swallowed armies for centuries. Inside, it was all confidence and slides: aircraft numbers, ammunition counts, timetables sketched in neat boxes. But beneath the statistics, a different rhythm beat in the chest of every man. They had felt the weight of silence in valleys that looked empty until they erupted in fire. One soldier shifted in his chair and whispered to the man beside him, "They say this one's easy." The helicopters lifted into the Afghan dawn, rotors beating the cold air into dust clouds that rolled across the staging ground. Soldiers crouched in the belly of the aircraft, helmets pulled low, rifles cradled against their chests. The metal floor shuddered beneath them as the engines screamed. The valley had been described on maps. Now it was coming alive beneath the rotors. Through the open side doors, the Shah-i-Kot stretched wide and still. Snow clung to the ridges, thin and sharp against the rising sun. Below, scattered mud brick homes sat silent, smoke absent from chimneys, fields abandoned. From above it looked quiet, almost harmless. The men didn't trust it. Some muttered prayers into the roar of the engines. Others stared fixedly at the ridgelines, trying to read shadows for movement. A few forced tight smiles, trading jokes that were really shields against fear. The valley floor opened up beneath them like a giant bowl. It was supposed to be empty. That's what the intelligence reports had said. The enemy would scatter quickly, the briefings promised, pressed into caves where American bombs would finish the job. But valleys in Afghanistan rarely matched maps. The helicopter pitched, descending fast. The roar inside the cabin grew deafening. Packs shifted, straps bit into shoulders. A soldier gripped the torn strap of his rucksack, knuckles pale, as if the weight of it mattered more than the weight of what waited below. 30 seconds, the crew chief shouted over the engine noise. Men rose, staggered by the motion, adjusting their helmets, checking the safeties on their rifles. Boots shuffled on the steel floor. The Shah-i-Kot loomed closer. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and snow. Soldiers poured out, boots hitting frozen dirt, eyes darting to ridgelines that looked too quiet. The air burned cold in their throats. Then the second helicopter landed. The third. Engines roared, the sound bouncing off the valley walls, echoing until it felt like the mountains themselves were vibrating. For a brief moment, silence followed. Just men in formation, rifles raised, scanning the emptiness. And then the silence broke. Mortars slammed into the valley floor. The first shell hit 20 yards from the lead squad, throwing dirt and fire into the air. The second detonated closer, the blast knocking men off their feet, ears ringing with white noise. Machine gun fire erupted from the ridges, tracer rounds streaking across the valley like orange knives. The ambush had begun. Soldiers dove for what little cover there was. Shallow ditches, rocks, the wreckage of low stone walls. Dust and snow filled their mouths as they pressed flat to the earth. Rifles raised blindly toward the ridgelines erupting with muzzle flashes. Radios crackled with chaos. Calls for medevac, reports of casualties. Confused orders tangled with static. The helicopters lifted fast, pilots fighting to pull clear as rounds stitched the air around them. One bird banked hard, smoke trailing from its side, limping away across the horizon. The valley that had looked empty was alive with fire. The Shah-i-Kot had been waiting. The men had stepped into a bowl designed to hold them in place. Enemy fighters, hundreds more than intelligence had promised, were dug into trenches and caves high above, rifles and RPGs zeroed in on the floor below. It was no sweep. It was no quick strike. It was a trap. Men pressed their helmets against the dirt, hearts hammering, trying to make themselves smaller as rounds cracked overhead. The smell of explosives and burned powder filled the air. Shouts of medics echoed, drowned by the endless thunder of gunfire. One soldier lifted his head just long enough to glimpse the ridgeline. Silhouettes darting, rifles flashing, enemies dug in deep. It was a vision that would burn itself into his memory. The Shah-i-Kot had swallowed them whole. The valley shook with fire. Mortars thudded into the dirt, showering rock and metal fragments across the squad still scrambling from the landing zone. Machine guns spat from the ridges, their lines of tracer cutting the dawn air into streams of orange light. Soldiers flattened themselves into the shallow ground, pressing faces against frozen earth. Boots scrambled, hands clawed for cover that didn't exist. The Shah-i-Kot was not terrain, it was a bowl, and they were trapped at its center. One man clutched his radio, screaming coordinates that were swallowed by static. Another dragged a wounded comrade by his vest, boots slipping in the mud, rifle dangling uselessly from his shoulder. Blood marked the dirt in dark lines, steam rising from it in the cold air. The helicopters had barely cleared the valley when the first RPGs streaked upward, hissing through the sky. One slammed into the side of a departing bird, shrapnel scattering in a fiery bloom. The aircraft lurched but kept flying, trailing smoke as it clawed for altitude. On the ground, chaos turned to terror. The enemy was everywhere, voices shouting in Pashto from unseen trenches, muzzle flashes winking from the jagged ridges, mortar teams hidden in caves that belched fire. The intelligence reports had been wrong. There weren't a few hundred fighters, there were thousands. The Americans fired back, rifles cracking in desperate bursts. Tracers streaked upward toward the rocks, but the ridgelines absorbed the fire without flinching. It was like shooting at the mountains themselves. One squad huddled behind a broken stone wall, their sergeant shouting above the roar, "Keep low! Return fire!" The wall shuddered as rounds tore into it, dust exploding into their eyes. A private's hands shook so badly he fumbled his magazine, spilling rounds into the dirt. "Focus!" the sergeant barked, slamming the magazine back into the weapon for him. But focus was nearly impossible. The valley had become a furnace of sound. Mortars thumping, machine guns hammering, radios screeching with half-finished calls. "Eagle 6, we are pinned. We need air. Multiple casualties. Repeat, multiple." Static swallowed the rest. High above, jets began to circle. The first bombs fell minutes later, B-52s releasing payloads that shook the valley to its core. The ground heaved, dirt and snow leaping skyward in pillars of fire. The echoes rolled like thunder trapped inside a drum. For a moment, silence. Then, impossibly, gunfire resumed. Fighters crawled out of trenches, emerged from caves, picked up weapons dropped by the dead. The mountains themselves seemed to breathe enemy fire. Pinned soldiers exchanged looks of disbelief. One whispered, "They don't stop." "They just don't stop." An RPG screamed into their position, striking just beyond the wall. The blast knocked men flat, ears ringing, eyes burning. A medic stumbled to his feet, dragging a wounded man by his vest straps, hands slick with blood. He shouted for bandages, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The valley floor was turning red. By midday, the situation was desperate. Squads scattered, communications broken, casualties mounting. The plan that had looked neat on briefing slides was gone, erased by the dust and fire of reality. A captain pressed his back to a boulder, clutching his radio, calling in airstrikes with a voice ragged from shouting. His men crouched around him, eyes wild, magazines nearly empty. The enemy fire never slowed. Mortars arced steadily into the valley. RPGs whistled from caves, machine guns rattled with inhuman rhythm. Every ridge was alive, every shadow a rifle. The Shah-i-Kot had been a trap from the beginning. And now, inside its walls, the Americans understood the truth. They had not come to sweep the valley. They had come to survive it. The valley floor was a patchwork of chaos. Scattered squads huddled in ditches, behind rocks, or pressed flat into the dirt while rounds snapped overhead. The neat formations of the landing zones were gone. The operation that had begun with confidence had splintered into survival. Men dug with their helmets, clawing at frozen ground to carve depressions shallow enough to shield their bodies. Their fingers bled, nails breaking on stone, but still they scraped. Anything to get lower, anything to be smaller. Machine gun fire hammered from the ridges, pinning them like insects under glass. Every attempt to move drew another storm of bullets. When a squad tried to sprint across open ground to reinforce a wounded comrade, half of them went down before reaching the far side. The survivors dragged themselves into cover, eyes wide with shock, skin gray from loss of blood. Medics worked frantically, crawling from body to body, pressing bandages into wounds that refused to close. They kept their voices low, teeth clenched as they whispered, "You're gonna make it. Just breathe." But some men didn't, and their silence became part of the valley's sound. Radios crackled constantly, but clarity was rare. Calls overlapped, static swallowed coordinates. "We're pinned, need air support. Request medevac, negative, can't land, too hot. We're cut off, we're out of ammo." A lieutenant huddled with his men behind a boulder, scanning the ridgelines through binoculars. He could see muzzle flashes in the caves, dark shapes moving along trenches dug into the snow. They weren't disorganized stragglers. They were entrenched, supplied, and disciplined. The valley was their fortress. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars, his face pale beneath the dirt. "They knew we were coming," he said flatly. His men nodded, grim recognition in their eyes. Training clashed with terror. Some soldiers fired steadily, conserving rounds, aiming for flashes on the ridges. Others sprayed wildly, emptying magazines in seconds, then fumbling with reloads, hands shaking so hard they dropped cartridges into the dirt. Their sergeants barked at them, slapping helmets, dragging them back to discipline by sheer force of will. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the valley. Sweat stung eyes, froze into uniforms where snow still clung to the shadows. Men licked dry lips, throats burning, but water bottles stayed sealed. Too dangerous to risk exposure just to drink. The ground around them became littered with spent brass, fragments of rock shattered by incoming rounds and blood darkening the soil. Every explosion carved new scars into the earth, but still the soldiers held. Not by choice, but because there was nowhere else to go. One squad huddled in a ditch barely deep enough to cover them. The dirt trembled with each mortar impact, loose soil raining onto their helmets. A private clutched his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white, whispering the same line again and again, "We're not getting out! We're not getting out!" His sergeant grabbed him by the collar, forcing him to meet his eyes. "You're here! You're fighting! That means you're getting out!" The words were harsh, but they steadied the men around him. In a place where rules no longer applied, authority mattered more than belief. By afternoon, air support screamed overhead. Jets roared across the valley, dropping ordnance that ripped into the ridges. The ground shook violently, smoke rising in black columns. B-52s followed, their bombs cratering the mountainsides in thunderous waves. The soldiers on the ground pressed themselves deeper into their shallow cover, dirt and snow raining down on them from the concussions. For a brief moment, hope flared. But when the smoke cleared, gunfire resumed. Fighters emerged from caves, dragging new weapons, firing RPGs into the valley below. The ridges were alive again, as though the bombs had done nothing. Desperation set in. Ammunition ran low. Men counted their magazines, passing them along to comrades with fewer rounds. "Make them count," one whispered, sliding his last clip into another man's hand. Through it all, the soldiers held their positions. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They endured. And as night began to fall, with the ridges still spitting fire and the valley floor scarred with bodies and craters, a quiet truth spread through the squads. Operation Anaconda was no longer an offensive. It was survival. The sweep had failed. The valley was not theirs. The Shah-i-Kot was holding them in its jaws, and the only thing left to do was fight until morning. The valley floor was death. Anyone who moved above the lip of a ditch or rock line drew fire instantly. Ammunition was running low, and the ridges spat bullets like unending rivers of steel. Commanders knew the truth. Unless someone broke the high ground, The valley would remain a killing bowl. Orders came down. Small teams would climb. Soldiers adjusted straps, checked grenades, and gritted their teeth against the climb. The ridges looked impossibly far, their jagged spines outlined against the harsh Afghan sky. The snow on their slopes glared white in the sun, marked here and there by the dark mouths of caves that looked like wounds. One team set off first. 10 men, faces drawn, moving from cover to cover along the valley's edge. Mortar shells thumped behind them, throwing dirt into the air. Bullets stitched the ground in front of their boots. Still, they advanced, bent low, rifles pressed tight against their chests. The climb began on loose rock that shifted under every step. Boots slipped, hands grabbed at ledges, fingernails tearing against stone. Packs dragged men backward, helmets banged into rocks. Sweat poured into their eyes despite the cold. Above them, muzzle flashes blinked like stars. The first man to crest a ledge drew fire instantly, rounds cracking into the rock inches from his head. He dropped flat, shouting for cover fire. The men below raised their rifles, sending bursts upward, trying to pin the enemy just long enough for the climbers to move. Grenades arced into caves, detonating with concussions that sent snow and dust sliding down the slope. Shouts in Pashto echoed from inside the rock, followed by bursts of machine gun fire. The fight on the ridges was closer, more brutal. No longer shadows on a distant horizon. Now the enemy was 20 yards away, ducking behind rocks, firing blindly over cover, shouting to each other in voices that carried above the wind. One soldier stumbled into a shallow trench and came face to face with a fighter crouched over a PKM machine gun. For an instant, both froze, eyes wide, breaths steaming in the cold air. Then training broke the hesitation. The soldier fired first. The man crumpled backward, his weapon clattering against the stones. It was not clean, it was not distant. It was survival measured in heartbeats. Other teams made their climbs on other ridges. Some never reached the top, cut down before they could crest. Others crawled on hands and knees, scraping across rock, firing upward in short bursts, advancing by inches. Radio calls carried frantic updates. "We're on the ridge, taking heavy fire." "Enemy dug in, need support now." "Multiple wounded, can't move them down the slope." Air strikes continued, bombs slamming into mountainsides so hard the ground convulsed beneath the men clinging to the rock. The concussions blew snow into their faces, rattled their teeth, and shook loose boulders that tumbled past, crushing anything in their path. Still, fighters emerged from the caves, burned, bloodied, half buried in rubble, yet still firing, still screaming, still refusing to yield. On one ridge, a squad fought house to house through a cluster of stone huts that clung like teeth to the slope. Bullets cracked through mud walls, grenades shattered doorways, men crashed through rooms with bayonets fixed. One hut caught fire, smoke choking everyone inside, enemy and American alike. Men stumbled out gasping, weapons still in their hands, blinded by tears and ash. The battle turned personal in moments like these. Rifles jammed from dust, men wrestled in doorways, knives flashing, helmets ripped away. It was war stripped of distance, fought with breath on the other man's face. By evening, some ridges were taken. American flags were not raised, only silence. Caves smoldered, trenches lay filled, and bodies dotted the snow. The survivors sat in the dirt, shoulders heaving, ears ringing. Their hands shook as they reloaded magazines that were nearly empty. The high ground was never fully won. For every bunker cleared, another opened fire from somewhere else. For every cave collapsed by a bomb, another revealed itself when fighters burst from the dark, weapons blazing. But the climbs had bought survival. With men on the ridges, the valley floor was no longer a killing bowl without end. The enemy fire slackened, fractured, forced to spread itself thinner. As night fell, the mountains glowed faintly with the smoke of burning huts and shattered trees. Soldiers dug into whatever cover they could find, laying side by side in shallow scrapes of rock and snow. The valley below flickered with muzzle flashes still, but here, on the ridges, the silence between bursts felt heavier than the noise. One man pulled his helmet low and whispered to no one in particular. This was supposed to be easy. No one answered. Night clung to the valley, black and sharp, broken only by the white flares of tracers stitching the sky. Soldiers lay in shallow scrapes, rifles pressed against their chests, breath steaming in the cold. Every sound was a threat. The pop of ice shifting on rocks, the thud of boots somewhere unseen, the crack of distant rifles carried on the wind. When the first jets screamed overhead, men lifted their heads just enough to glimpse dark shapes cutting across the stars. The roar was deafening, rattling bones in their chests. Then the ground itself opened. B-52s had been called in. Bombs fell in waves, dozens at a time, tumbling from the high, invisible bellies of aircraft. They struck the ridges with a violence that defied description. Mountains convulsed. Snow leapt into the air like geysers. Entire sections of rock collapsed in fire. The earth heaved under the soldiers lying on the valley floor, their teeth clacking as shock waves rolled through them. One man clutched his helmet and muttered, "It's like God is tearing the world apart." Another whispered back, "Then why are they still shooting?" Because even as the bombs fell, even as smoke rose in black pillars and fire licked at the ridges, muzzle flashes returned. Enemy fighters clawed their way out of collapsed trenches, crawled from shattered caves, lifted rifles with hands burned and bleeding. The sky burned, but the valley answered back. For hours, the air campaign thundered. F-15S and F-16S dove low, releasing laser-guided bombs that shrieked through the night before detonating in blossoms of fire. Apache helicopters hovered, spitting rockets into dark crevices where gunfire still flickered. The mountain ridges lit up like jagged teeth glowing from within. On the ground, soldiers pressed themselves flat, ears ringing, eyes wide. The concussions shook loose stones that rolled down slopes, bouncing past helmets, clattering into rifles. Dust and smoke mixed with the thin mountain air until every breath tasted like ash. Yet still, the enemy fired. Mortar rounds arced into the valley, bursting among squads already scattered and bleeding. Machine guns rattled from bunkers that seemed to regenerate. An RPG streaked through the smoke, striking near a supply drop and scattering crates of ammunition across the dirt. Men stared in disbelief. They had seen entire ridges vanish under the weight of bombs. They had felt the ground buckle beneath them, and yet the fighters returned, as if the mountain itself birthed them. A captain gripped his radio, voice raw as he shouted coordinates. "Again! Hit it again!" His men crouched around him, faces streaked with soot and sweat, rifles limp in their hands from exhaustion. Another wave of bombs fell, shaking the valley so violently that men bit their tongues bloody. Flames clawed into the night sky, hot winds rushing down the slopes to wash over the men below. Silence followed. Not peace, silence, the kind that hovers like a question. Then, like the valley itself mocking them, gunfire resumed. Sporadic at first, then steady, then roaring again in the same relentless rhythm. One soldier spat into the dirt, his face twisted with rage. "How many are there?" he growled. The translator beside him, an Afghan fighter who had seen these mountains all his life, only shook his head. "More than the maps said. More than they will ever say." By dawn, the mountains looked broken, pockmarked with craters, slopes scarred black with soot, snow melted into rivulets of dirty water. The air reeked of burned rock and twisted metal. But the fight was far from over. As the sun rose, enemy fighters appeared again on the ridges, silhouetted against the orange light. Some carried rifles. Others dragged mortars into position. A few carried the wounded down into caves, their silhouettes as steady as shadows in the dawn. The airstrikes had been meant to break them. Instead, they had shown something else, that the Shah-i-Kot could absorb more punishment than anyone had imagined. The soldiers on the valley floor tightened their grips on their rifles, exhaustion etched into every face. Their ears still rang from the night's bombardment. Their nerves buzzed with adrenaline that no longer had anywhere to go. They had seen the sky burn. They had felt the world end and rebuild itself around them. And now, as the sun lit up the ridges, they realized something grim. The fight was only just beginning. When the last echoes of the airstrikes faded, the valley was left in a darkness so complete it felt alive. Smoke hung low, blotting out the stars. The ridges loomed as blacker shadows against the black, dotted here and there with the flicker of enemy muzzle fire. Soldiers lay in the dirt, clutching rifles against their chests, eyes straining for movement. Their ears rang from the bombardments, leaving the world muffled and strange. Each heartbeat felt like thunder in their skulls. The cold came quickly. By midnight, the temperature had plunged below freezing. Breath crystallized in the air. Helmets grew slick with frost, and fingers went numb even inside gloves. Men huddled together in shallow scrapes carved with bleeding hands, pressing against one another not for comfort, but for heat. Sleep was impossible. Any attempt to close their eyes was broken by the crack of rifles, the thump of mortars, or the hiss of an RPG slicing the night. The enemy fired in bursts, probing, reminding them that the ridges were never empty. Silence was never safety. Silence was only the pause before the next attack. A private pressed his face into the dirt, whispering prayers in a language only he understood. Another soldier stared at the stars between smoke clouds, lips moving as he mouthed the names of his children. The valley floor became a confessional, each man bargaining quietly with the darkness. Radios squawked with clipped voices, reports of ammunition running low, requests for medevac denied because helicopters couldn't risk the fire. The static carried fragments of desperation, but never answers. A medic crawled from body to body, checking bandages by touch alone. He whispered to the wounded, "Stay with me. Just keep breathing." In the dark, he couldn't see their faces, only felt the sticky warmth of blood soaking through gauze. Some groaned, some said nothing. He moved on because stopping was not an option. The enemy's voices carried from the ridges, shouts in Pashto, sometimes laughter. They knew the Americans were trapped below, shivering, bleeding, waiting. The mountains gave their voices an eerie echo, bouncing them down to the valley floor so that they seemed to come from everywhere at once. One soldier muttered bitterly, "They sound warm." Another answered, "They sound like they own this place." The hours dragged. Men shifted from side to side to keep blood moving in their limbs. Boots stiffened with frost. Hands refused to obey fingers, making rifles heavy, magazines slippery. Every cough, every movement felt like it might draw fire. In the rare moments of quiet, the valley seemed almost peaceful. The mountains stood silent, the air sharp, the stars cold and clear. But the silence never lasted. The enemy always broke it with another burst of gunfire, another mortar shell, another reminder that dawn was still far away. When the sky finally began to pale, it was not relief but exhaustion that washed over the soldiers. Their bodies ached, their eyes burned, their throats were raw from the dry air. Some hadn't spoken in hours. Others mumbled to themselves, clinging to scraps of thought that kept them tethered to something beyond the valley. They had survived the night, but survival felt fragile. The ridges were still alive with fire. The valley was still a bowl of death. The promise of a quick operation was gone, burned away in the cold hours between dusk and dawn. At roll call, men answered weakly, their voices hoarse. The names sounded hollow against the backdrop of gunfire still echoing from the mountains. Some names were not answered at all. The sun rose over the Shah-i-Kot, lighting the scarred ridges in shades of orange and red. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky, and the wind carried the acrid stench of explosives and blood. Men blinked against the light, their eyes red-rimmed, their bodies heavy. Another day had begun. Another day to hold on, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. And as they stared at the ridges, rifles trembling in frozen hands, one truth carved itself into every mind. This valley would not be taken quickly. It would take everything they had. By the third day, the valley was running dry. Ammunition had been fired until barrels smoked and hands blistered. Water bottles were drained to the last drops. Bandages were strips of cloth torn from uniforms. Men counted their magazines again and again, as if rechecking could somehow make the bullets multiply. Resupply became a lifeline. Helicopters circled high above, waiting for the chance to dive through the storm of fire. Cargo drops came by parachute, crates tumbling through the thin Afghan air. Men sprinted into open ground to drag them back, every step a gamble. Bullets chased them across the dirt, striking sparks off rocks, shredding parachute silk. But they went anyway, because without those crates the valley would starve of bullets, and starvation here meant death. One squad ripped open a box expecting ammunition and found rations instead. Heavy foil packets of food no one had the appetite for. They cursed, but shoved them into their packs anyway. Another crate hit hard, splintering open to spill medical supplies across the ground. Men scooped up morphine syrettes, tourniquets, and bandages, stuffing them into their pouches as though each item was a weapon in its own right. Ammunition was rationed carefully. Sergeants ordered their men to fire only when targets were clear. Bursts grew shorter, shots more deliberate. The chaos of the first day gave way to grim economy. Every trigger pull had to matter. Alongside the Americans fought Afghan allies, lean men with battered rifles, scarves pulled tight against the cold. They moved with a knowledge of the terrain that no briefing could teach, slipping between rocks, pointing out trails invisible to outsiders. Some fought with ferocity, hurling themselves up slopes under fire. Others hesitated, their loyalty questioned in whispers around the American positions, but without them, the valley would have been even more impossible. One interpreter sat huddled beside a squad, his radio crackling in both languages. He relayed orders, shouted warnings, and translated cries for medics. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow, but his voice never faltered. To the Americans, he was a bridge, to the Afghans, a lifeline. Wounded men piled up faster than evacuation could clear them. Medevac helicopters tried to land, rotors chopping the air, but incoming fire drove them off again and again. When one bird finally set down, men carried the injured toward it under a hail of gunfire, stumbling across open ground with bodies slung over their shoulders. Not every wounded man agreed to go. Some, pale and shaking, refused evacuation. "I stay with my squad," one whispered through clenched teeth, blood soaking his sleeve. He clutched his rifle in his remaining good hand, pushing away the medic who tried to guide him to the helicopter. Others nodded, understanding. To leave was to abandon brothers. To stay was to bleed beside them. The valley floor grew littered with the detritus of desperation. Empty magazine scattered like leaves. Shattered crates, broken parachute cords, and torn rations spilled across the dirt. Men chewed dry crackers with cracked lips, washed them down with melted snow scooped into helmets. The enemy never let them rest. Mortars continued to arc down from the ridges, landing with the heavy thump of inevitability. RPGs shrieked from hidden caves. Sniper fire cracked across open ground, forcing men to keep their heads buried in the dirt. One night, during a lull, a soldier whispered to his friend, "I dreamed I was home." Woke up with frost on my face. His friend didn't answer. He was staring at the mountains, eyes hollow, whispering to himself in a loop, "We're not getting out, we're not getting out." But they did not break. They rationed, they crawled, they scavenged. They refused to surrender ground. By the end of the week, reinforcements trickled in. More men, more guns, more supplies, but even with help, the Shah-i-Kot remained defiant. The valley did not yield. Every ridge still spat fire. Every cave still hid a rifle. Every night still carried the whispers of enemies who knew the land better than any map. For the men on the ground, resupply was not relief. It was only permission to keep fighting. And fight they did, because to stop meant the valley would swallow them whole. By the second week, the Shah-i-Kot looked like a scar carved into the mountains. Smoke clung to the ridges, craters pocked the slopes, and blackened trees stood like skeletons against the sky. The valley floor was torn apart by explosions, trenches of dirt carved by mortar blasts. The enemy was still there. Fighters emerged from new caves as though the mountain kept birthing them. They dragged mortars into position, fired RPGs until the tubes melted, and then picked up rifles to keep shooting. It seemed endless, and for the men on the ground the idea of victory felt as distant as home. But something had shifted. Reinforcements arrived in waves, more infantry, more Afghan allies, more aircraft overhead. The valley was no longer just a bowl of trapped squads. It had become a staging ground for coordinated strikes. Commanders began to push men not just to survive, but to advance. The assaults started ridge by ridge. Squads moved in short bursts, bounding forward under covering fire. Machine guns rattled, grenades arced high, and men scrambled up slopes that had once seemed unclimbable. Every step was met with resistance. Every bunker cleared came at a price. On one slope, a squad stormed a trench dug deep into the rock. The fight was vicious, close enough that men could smell the sweat and gunpowder of the enemy. Rifles fired point blank, knives flashed in the chaos, and grenades detonated in spaces too small to escape. When the trench finally fell silent, the survivors sat in the dirt, gasping, blood soaking through their gloves. The ridge was theirs, for now. Elsewhere, air power pounded relentlessly. Jets screamed low, dropping precision bombs into cave mouths. The concussions rolled down the valley like thunder. B-52s returned, blanketing the ridges with fire until the very air seemed to shake. And yet, even as the mountains collapsed, fighters crawled out, dragging wounded comrades firing wildly into the smoke. But for the first time, the Americans were not being driven back. They were pressing forward. Inch by inch, trench by trench, they began to claim the high ground. The enemy fire slackened. Mortars grew less frequent. Machine guns fell silent one by one. Prisoners taken alive were few, but those who were captured looked gaunt, eyes burning with the certainty of men who had fought until they could fight no more. By the 12th day, the valley sounded different. Gunfire still echoed, but it no longer surrounded the men. It came in pockets, bursts from caves and gullies that were quickly silenced. The endless storm of the first days had broken into scattered squalls. A captain stood on a ridge overlooking the valley floor, the wind snapping at his scarf. His radio hissed with updates. Squads reporting ground taken, caches destroyed, enemy numbers thinning. He lowered the handset, staring at the smoke rising from the mountains. His men stood beside him, shoulders slumped, rifles hanging limp, eyes hollow. They were winning, but victory here did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, like survival stretched to the breaking point. When the last major ridge was taken, silence fell heavier than the bombardments. No mortars, no machine guns, no RPGs. Just the sound of wind across rock and the quiet groans of the wounded. The Shah-i-Kot was finally breaking. The men didn't cheer. They didn't raise flags. They sat in the dirt, helmets pushed back, faces streaked with soot and tears, and simply breathed. One soldier stared at the horizon and muttered, "This was supposed to be over in hours." Another answered, "It took 16 days." 16 days of fire, blood, and survival. Operation Anaconda was ending, but its cost was carved into every scar on the valley floor and into the hearts of every man who walked out alive. The valley was quiet at last. For the first time in 16 days, no mortars fell from the ridges. No machine guns rattled across the bowl of dirt and snow. No RPGs streaked through the sky. The Shah-i-Kot sat under a pale sun, its mountains scarred black from bombs, its ridges littered with craters and collapsed caves. The silence was heavy, like the breath held after a scream. Soldiers moved cautiously through the valley floor, rifles raised, eyes scanning every shadow. They expected the silence to be broken at any moment, for one last ambush to rip through the stillness. But nothing came. The ridges that had spat fire day and night were empty now. The caves no longer roared with voices. They had won. If winning was what you could call it. Bodies dotted the valley, some American, many Afghan, more still belonging to the fighters who had refused to yield. Smoke rose from smoldering bunkers. The air smelled of cordite, blood, and earth that had been torn apart too many times. Medics moved slowly between the wounded, their hands raw and blistered from bandaging more men than they could count. Chaplains knelt in the dirt, whispering last rites to soldiers whose eyes no longer saw. Engineers marked caves with spray paint, the crude orange X's signaling that they were cleared, or collapsed, or still too dangerous to enter. On one ridge, a squad sat slumped in the snow, helmets off, steam rising from their breath. They passed a canteen between them, the water inside tasting of metal and dirt, but better than nothing. None of them spoke. Words felt out of place. A captain gathered his men and delivered the news in a voice that was more tired than triumphant. "The valley is secure." The words echoed in the cold air, landing flat. Secure meant nothing here. Secure meant they had survived. Letters were written in the days that followed. Soldiers crouched on ammo crates, pencils scratching against thin sheets of paper. Some wrote simply, "I'm alive." Others tried to explain what had happened, but no words seemed to fit. How do you describe a valley that swallowed men whole? How do you tell families that victory meant days of watching friends bleed into the dirt? One man wrote, "They told us it would be over in hours. It took 16 days. I will never forget this valley." He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with hands that still trembled. The valley itself bore witness to what had happened. Craters scarred the ridges, snow stained black with soot and red with blood. Trees lay splintered, their branches shattered by shrapnel. Stone huts clung to the slopes, burned hollow, their walls cracked open. Everywhere was the evidence of survival bought at a cost no one had been prepared to pay. Afghan allies walked among the Americans, their faces as gaunt and hollow as those of the soldiers beside them. Some carried their dead wrapped in blankets, murmuring prayers as they moved toward the valley's edge. Others leaned on rifles, eyes fixed on the mountains, already calculating what the next battle would demand. When the last helicopter lifted from the valley, its rotors beating smoke into the air, the men aboard looked down one final time. The Shah-i-Kot stretched below them like a scar across the land, silent, vast, and unbroken, despite everything thrown at it. They had come with promises of an easy sweep. They had left with 16 days carved into their bodies and minds. For years afterward, the men who survived would remember the taste of dust, the burn of frost on their skin, the endless thunder of bombs, and the silence that followed. They would remember clawing into the dirt with bleeding hands, dragging wounded brothers across open ground, rationing bullets as if each one was life itself, and they would remember that the valley never truly surrendered. It only grew quiet. Operation Anaconda ended in March 2002 with the Shah-i-Kot Valley in American hands. The reports called it a victory. But the men who fought there knew better. It was not triumph, it was survival. They walked away carrying names in their heads, scars on their bodies, and the knowledge that no map, no briefing, no promise of easy could ever capture the truth of war. The valley had its own truth, and it was written in blood.